criminals do not want to leave behind records of criminality. The Zionists were well aware of this from the 1920s. The Palestinians were not going to leave on their own. And then if you sort of add two and two together, you get four. But it's a blueprint for ethnic cleansing.
All right, so hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Book Cafe Podcast. My guest for today's episode is Dr. Zach Foster, a historian of Palestine. And our episode for today will center mostly around his 2017 dissertation entitled The Invention of Palestine. We have a lot of stuff to cover, so let's just dive right in. So Dr. Zach Foster, welcome to the show. It's really great to connect with you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Okay. So, Zach, before we get deep dive into your dissertation, would you mind telling us a little bit more about yourself? I'm extremely interested to know a bit more about your cultural and your education background. So maybe you could just start out with that, and then we can talk more about your dissertation. Yeah.
Sure thing. I grew up in Michigan, in the great state of Michigan, in a suburb of Detroit, going to Jewish schools and Jewish summer camps and Jewish youth groups. And that got me really interested in Israel-Palestine from the Israeli perspective. And as the curious person that I was, at some point got much more interested in the Palestinian perspective. And as far as my educational background goes, I did my undergrad at the University of Michigan, did grad school at Georgetown, and then Princeton, focusing on Arab history, Middle East history, and specifically the history of Palestine.
Okay, awesome. So Detroit wasn't very far from where I actually did my undergrad. So Windsor, Ontario. So it's just right across the border in Canada.
Sure.
So that's awesome.
Yeah,
so
love Windsor.
Yeah. Okay. So Zach, let me just start with the name of your dissertation. So the Invention of Palestine. Can you tell us why you chose this for your dissertation? So maybe you could just help us understand that before we deep dive more into it.
Yeah, absolutely. So over the past number of decades, there has been a burgeoning literature that I would describe as the invention of literature. Okay, so you have books written called The Invention of Science, The Invention of Nature, The Invention of the Jewish People, The Invention of Israel. So what social scientists and historians have realized over the past number of decades is that most of what we study as social scientists, as historians, is invented, right? Even think of things that you might think are natural or part of the natural world, things like science. Science is itself an invention. Nature, the concept that there are these things in the world that are, natural, and that itself is an invention. And obviously, all the more so, places, countries, religions, ethnicities, all of these things are invented things. They're all just things that human beings made up. If you ask a biologist, what is Germany? If you ask a pedologist, someone who studies soil, what is France? They will not be able to provide you any definition of what French soil is as compared to what German soil is. Those are not scientific categories. They do not exist in nature. They're things human beings made up. And so that is sort of the starting point of the dissertation, which is to say that this idea, Palestine, this identity, Palestinian identity, that is something that human beings made up. And so then the question is, well, if human beings made it up, well, when did they make it up, first of all? And why did they make it up? And also, how did they make it up? And then the dissertation tries to answer those questions.
And Zach, how important is this question to figure out where Palestine, or the name itself, or the etymology of Palestine, where it came from? Is it really pertinent in today's day and age, given the ongoing conflict that we see in the Middle East? Your thoughts on that, please.
I think the answer in a word is no. Whether or not Palestine and a Palestinian identity dates to the 19th century or the 17th century or the 11th century, the answer to that question is unrelated to the question of, should there be a ceasefire in Gaza now? Should Israel be allowed to forcibly displace 1,800 people from Masafar Yatta in the West Bank? Those are unrelated questions. One is a question of curiosity, of history, of trying to understand the past, trying to understand what happened in the past. Another is a question of international humanitarian law.
Right.
So those are very different questions, and I think it's very, very important that we separate them. I think a lot of Zionists and a lot of Jews and a lot of Palestinians want to conflate them. But to answer your question, in my view, they're completely unrelated questions.
Right. Okay. So I just want to read something out that you wrote very early in your dissertation. So you mentioned a couple of factors that led to the proliferation of the word Palestine and Palestinian, and I believe you mentioned up to four factors. So would you mind telling us a couple of them? Just to recap it for our audience who haven't read your dissertation yet. Yeah.
So, as a starting point, when I'm trying to understand how a Palestinian identity evolves over in time,
Hmm.
I'm starting with the a question of like, what is a Palestinian identity? Like, what are the constituent elements of a Palestinian identity? And so, first of all, it's an identity based around Palestine that differentiates it from other identities, like religious identities or ethnic identities or racial identities, which are not based around places. So, if an identity is based around a place, I think first and foremost, we need to understand how that place comes to be in the world. Why it is that people know about it.
Hmm.
How is it that you and I know about places in the first place? Well, we've seen maps of the place, so we have an idea of what the place looks like, at least on paper, because it's
Hmm.
too big to. You can't actually like see the place with just your own two eyes because it's too big for that. So you need to see it. You need to see it visualized in the form of a map. So
Hmm.
what I do is I try and understand, when did maps of Palestine proliferate in history? And my argument is that the more maps of
Hmm.
Palestine there are in circulation, in schools, in government bureaucracies, in other types of institutions, the more likely it is you will see an identity based around that place, Palestine. The more likely it is you will see a Palestinian identity. So
Right.
maps play a big role. Um, Also histories and geographies, right? If a place is important, then someone probably has written a history about it and someone has
Hmm.
written a geography about it. So what I try and do is trace the origins and development of maps, of books, of
Hmm.
geography and history based around those places. Um, and then the other thing I would say is I also look for institutions based around the place. It tends to be the case over the course of human history that institutions oftentimes will embrace a place name. So they will become kind of like a Palestinian bank, the Bank of Palestine, right? You'll have a Palestinian educational bookshop, right? So those things are starting to you start to see those things in the early 20th century. You did not see those things in the early 19th century or the early 15th century or the early 11th century. And that's partly because I think places, these big places, they become more important. Um, especially in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. And I think in large part because of nationalism, because you get this ideology in Europe developing in the 18th and 19th centuries that basically says, nations have homelands.
Hmm.
There's all these nations in the world, and they all have national homelands. And states they grab onto this ideology because it serves their interests, and for all kinds of reasons which we don't need to get into. But states embrace this ideology, and so what happens as a result of that is that the states, they issue books of history and geography about the place that is the nation, that is the national homeland. They create institutions based on those places.
Hmm.
They introduce curriculum teaching people about the importance of the place. So it's not just that the place exists, but it's that it's important, that you should
Hmm.
you should feel a sense of loyalty to the place.
Right.
So those are some of the reasons why I think places become important in history. These big places become important in history. It's because the proliferation of maps, proliferation of geography and history books about those places, the proliferation of states based in those places, and those states then create these national identities to push those places into schools, into homes, into institutions, and then people end up caring about those places to such an extent that they even are willing to sacrifice their lives for those places. They believe that these places are so connected to their identity; they identify with these places. So that's kind of a very at an abstract level. I know I'm speaking in quite abstract terms,
Hmm.
but in my opinion, that is kind of how these places like Palestine come about in history and why we care so much about them.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. And thank you so much for that, Zach. It's a really elaborate answer. I'm sure that we can pick it apart as we go along. So let me just ask you this. When it comes to the word Palestine and its etymology and its origin story, what are some of the myths that are attached to it? And You had one video on your YouTube channel where you were giving a rebuttal to Rudy Rockman, and you listed about 6 myths about the origin of the word Palestine, which he was, he sort of put that out in his video, and you gave a rebuttal to that. And I found that to be quite hilarious. And I would encourage everyone who is listening or watching this podcast to go and take a look at that particular rebuttal video. But would you mind just recapping all the 6 points that you listed in that video? And just take us through that one by one if you could, or at least name 3 of them out of the 6. So
Sure thing. So there's a very popular myth that in 135 CE, the emperor of Rome, Hadrian,
yeah.
he crushed the Bar Kokhba revolt and erased the name Judea, which was the name of this Judean kingdom, which had been established a few years earlier. He crushed the Bar Kokhba revolt vengefully and replaced the name Judea with Palestine. In spite of, because Palestine was the Philistines, that was the enemy of the Israelites in the Hebrew Bible, right? So he did it out of spite. And that's a myth, right? Because we don't actually know that happened. We don't know that Hadrian changed the name of Palestine at all. It could have well been the case. There's no documentary evidence or literary evidence at all that Hadrian changed the name. It may have been a process of dynamic evolution whereby after the revolt ended, the revolt was put down violently by Hadrian, right. That a new name, the erstwhile name of the region before it was known as Judea, resurfaced and reemerged and became the name once again, because we know that the name in Palestine, Palestina, in ancient Greek, it was used prior to the Bar Kokhba revolt, and it was used after the Bar Kokhba revolt put down. So it may have just been a case of dynamic evolution. But even if you accept the argument that Hadrian actually did through imperial decree, he renamed the province Palestina. He actually renamed it Syria Palestina, Palestinian Syria, not Palestine, which already in and of itself, I think is evidence that refutes the claim that he used the name Palestine as vengeance to choose the name of the ancient Israelites as enemy. Well, if he did that, he would have chosen Palestina, not Palestinian Syria. But even if you accept that it was an imperial decree, we also know that Hadrian himself was very fond of Greek culture and Greek customs and Greek etymology. And there are other Greek cities, other Roman cities that he changed the name of. And replaced the Roman name with the erstwhile Greek name. And I write about that in my dissertation. So this is one myth. But again, it's used. The reason why, so the question really is like, why is it that, 2,000 years later, you have these historians kind of making this argument really without any real hard evidence, and then it just becomes accepted as fact by all of these historians. No one, as far as I can tell, I'm really the first person to really seriously challenge this idea. And I'm not even saying it's wrong. I'm just saying it's a theory. It's a theory based on very thin evidence, and there are other theories that could well explain it. So that's kind of one myth. There are many other myths about Palestine. There's another very popular myth that goes something to the effect of, in the ancient world, the name Palestine was used, and then over the course of a millennia and a half of history, the name Palestine fell out of use, and basically nobody in Palestine actually called the place Palestine. That's also a myth. From the period of the Islamic conquest until the 11th century Crusader conquest, the name Palestine was used in Arabic. Okay, right. It was actually it was called Jund Philistine. It was a province, a district within the Umayyad Caliphate, and then after the Crusader conquest, and especially after an earthquake hit Ramleh, which was the capital of Jund Philistine, that name fell out of use at the administrative level. So it was no longer a political district. But of course, Muslims and Christians and Jews continue to use that word. And so if you look at the historical record, if you look at the chronicles, if you look at the hadith literature, if you look at Sira, the biographical literature, if you look at Fada'il literature, if you look at the merits literature, all of these different genres of literature in Islamic literature and hagiography, go to the Christian literature, same thing. Basically, they're all writing about Palestine. Right. I mean, it would be hard to find a period of 5 or 10 years in history over the past millennia and a half. You would be hard pressed to find a single 5-year period where the name Palestine doesn't appear in one or another text written by a Muslim or a Christian or an Arab. And the reason is simple. because all of these writers, because they were constantly referencing and citing the earlier texts of their tradition, which all used the word Palestine because they were written in a time period when Palestine was itself an administrative district. So because of that, they're continually citing and referencing the word Palestine, kind of the same way you and I have heard of the phrase Mesopotamia, have heard of the phrase Phoenicia.
Right.
Even though we probably wouldn't call Lebanon Phoenicia, but we still know what Phoenicia is. We probably wouldn't call Iraq Mesopotamia, but if we saw the word, we would know what it's referring to.
Yeah.
For the same reason, Muslims in the 15th century and the 13th century and the 18th and 19th century would have known what that word was. And that's the first point I would make. The second point I would make was there's a preponderance of sources from the city of Ramleh, a preponderance of Muslims and Christians who are using the word Palestine in their day-to-day speech, not citing some ancient source in a history book or a hadith literature book or merits literature book. No, they're clearly writing about their day-to-day life, and they're using the word Palestine. And I could cite you a half dozen Muslims and Christians from Ramleh, from the 12th century to the 19th and early 20th century, of Muslims and Christians from Ramleh who seem to be using that word. So I do think the word Palestine, Philistine, is used to describe the land of Palestine continuously for the past 1,400 years. So that is my argument, and I make that argument in my dissertation. So those are maybe two of the myths. Maybe I'll mention a third myth, and then we can move on. But the third myth I would say is that there's this belief that they didn't call the place Palestine in the first half of the 20th century. They called it Southern Syria. Maybe you've heard this myth, and it's a very interesting myth. But just to kind of first give you a sense of where this belief comes from and why so many Zionists and Israel supporters today love telling you that the Palestinians actually always called themselves Southern Syrians. So it comes from this episode in 1918. In 1918, the British, so it's World War I, right? It's kind of the end of World War I. The British conquer Palestine during the war. And they establish, and then they also basically conquer the rest. I mean, so then in 1918, so the British are now in control of Palestine. Meanwhile, you have the Arab Revolt during World War I, in which the Sharif Hussein of Mecca signs this secret agreement with the British. It's famously known as the Hussein McMahon. This is the Hussein McMahon Correspondence.
Right, Hussein McMahon Correspondence. Yeah. Okay, I stand corrected.
And so basically, so basically, the British agree to provide support to this Sharif Hussein of Mecca and his son, King Abdullah. And so basically, he goes and conquers. He takes his troops who are based in the Arabian Peninsula, in Medina and Mecca, and they go up Transjordan and conquer Jordan, destroying, attacking Ottoman troops along the way. And then they finally reach Damascus in 1918. And establish an independent Arab kingdom in Damascus. And for the first time in 400 years, you have an independent Arab state in the Levant, in Syria. And for Palestinians sitting in Jerusalem, in Jaffa, and in Hebron, now under British occupation, the same Brits who had recently embraced the Balfour Declaration, which was a declaration to transform Palestine from an Arab country into a Jewish country, and support Zionist immigration to Palestine. So basically, the Palestinians now living under British occupation, subject to the Zionist, quite likely subject to the Zionist program. So they, in 1918, basically passed, in 1919 and 1920, pass all these resolutions and publish all these books and make all these declarations saying, Palestine was never called Palestine. It was always called Southern Syria, right? Even though the phrase Southern Syria is very difficult to find in Arabic literature before 1918. Nobody called the place Southern Syria in 1917 or 1915. It was a result of this, of the establishment of this Arab kingdom and the desire to unite with their independent Arab kingdom in Damascus, rather than be subject to British Zionist rule from Jerusalem. So it was out of their love for Palestine and out of their desire to shield Palestine from British Zionist colonial rule that led them to say there is no such thing as Palestine. It's actually called Southern Syria. So that is how the whole affair came about. And then, of course, in 1920, the French through the Sykes-Picot Agreement, as you correctly pointed out,
Hmm.
the French brutally overthrow this independent Arab state. They kill the leaders of the revolt or push them into exile and create a French mandate of Syria and then afterwards of Lebanon. But of course, all these Palestinians in Palestine, many of whom, by the way, played key roles in that administration. People forget
Hmm.
it was Faisal, King Faisal is the guy who established this kingdom. He was, I incorrectly said his son was Abdullah. Sorry, Sharif Hussein of Mecca's son was King Faisal.
Right.
King Faisal
Both. Yeah.
establishes this kingdom in Damascus,
Hmm.
and many of his most important advisors were Palestinian. Aouni Abdul Hadi was his number two. He was Palestinian from Nablus.
Hmm.
His inner circle, his head of police, his head of secret police was also a Palestinian. Now I forget his name, but you had many of the most important advisors to this Syrian kingdom were Palestinians. So of course the Palestinians were very much in support of this kingdom. And then of course in the decades after his regime was overthrown violently by the French, you have many Palestinians are reminiscing, oh, the good old days, Palestine has always been a part of southern Syria, right? So they're reminiscing kind of this anti-colonial regime, this semi-democratic regime. It had a representative assembly, the Syrian Congress, which included many Palestinians. So they're reminiscing the good old days. And then what happens later in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s is you get all these Zionists sort
Hmm.
of digging up these anecdotes from
Yeah.
Palestinians in the 30s and 40s, basically saying, look, they called it Southern Syria, not Palestine. And so that's kind of the very ironic history of the Palestinian embrace of the phrase Southern Syria.
Wow. Yeah, wow. Who would have thought it? So thank you, Zach, so much for that really comprehensive answer. You mentioned King Abdullah the First, and I have to ask you this. What is his beef with the Palestinians? Why was he so averse to the Palestinians that he even went so far as to ban the word Palestine after the Jordanians had conquered the West Bank in 1948? Do tell us about that.
Yeah, so recall that the Peel Commission of 1937, it's this commission the British issue.
Hmm.
They're trying to understand the violence, right? Because you get this anti-colonial revolt, Palestinians in 1936, after a decade and a half of imperial rule, in which the British decide to transform Palestine from a Palestinian Arab country into a Jewish homeland. The Palestinians are not happy about that. They're not happy about being second-class citizens in their own country and being subjected to minority rule in their own home country. So they object that, and eventually that boils over into revolt in 1936. And then in 1937, the British are like, "What went wrong?" So they're trying to figure out how to deal with this Palestine problem, and so they issue this report called the Peel Commission report, which basically proposes it's the first kind of partition proposal in which they say, look, there's Jews and there's Palestinians, and they both have national aspirations, and why don't we divide the country? Let's partition the country, right? That always goes well. So they but they what they all but the proposal basically says that the Palestinian Arab part of Palestine should kind of be connected to Jordan, should be sort of included within the Transjordanian monarchy, in some capacity. And so obviously the Transjordan is very happy about the Peel Commission, and basically in 1948, what happens? Transjordan occupies the West Bank. They take over. I mean, it wasn't known as the West Bank then. It later became known as the West Bank, right? But basically, they try and take their piece of Palestine. They're like, well, the British were on board with us being in control of Arab Palestine, and so they basically occupy a huge swath of Palestine.
Right.
And and then not only do they occupy this huge swath of Palestine, but then you get hundreds of thousands of refugees who were fleeing the violence, right? Who were escaping Zionist massacres and Zionist expulsions. They flock to the West Bank. So you have this massive Palestinian refugee population, as well as all of these Palestinians who were already living there, now basically under Jordanian rule. And the Jordanian monarchy is like obviously very worried that all of these Palestinians who have national aspirations are a threat to his rule. And he's absolutely correct about that, because in 1951, King Abdullah of Jordan is assassinated on the steps of the Al-Aqsa Mosque.
Right.
he's assassinated in Jerusalem
Mm,
and by a Palestinian who I believe was supported and funded by Haj Amin al-Husseini.
mm,
So anyways, basically, so then what happens over the course of the next 2 decades is that Palestinians in Jordan, in Transjordan,
mm,
are suppressed.
mhm.
You have anecdotes, for example, a Palestinian professor, I forget her name now. She published a memoir she published a memoir maybe a decade and a half ago of her childhood in the
Mhm.
1950s and 60s,
Yeah,
growing up in basically Jordanian occupied Ramallah,
right.
in which she talks about how the teacher asked her, like, where's she from? She's like, I'm from
Mm.
Palestine.
And
And the
right,
teacher slaps her,
a couple
just,
of times, yeah.
where are you from? And she gets slapped again. I mean, she's this 8-year-old, 9-year-old girl,
11,
schoolgirl,
11
excuse me,
year old, yeah.
11-year-old schoolgirl, and doesn't
Yeah,
understand the politics of the whole situation.
yeah.
But that is kind of a short history of, and then of course the Jordanians are scared that a vast majority of this Jordanian monarchy is of Palestinian descent, and so they're
Hmm.
worried, honestly, rightly so,
Yeah.
being this autocratic regime in a country that is majority Palestinian.
Hmm.
And that breeds fear, and eventually, I mean, it boils over in 1970 into Black September, in which you have all these Palestinian militants based in the West Bank who are then massacred and shelled and besieged by the Jordanian monarchy.
Hmm. Absolutely. Well, the only reason I was able to correct you there was because I had my cheat sheet with me, Zach. But thank you so much once again for that really comprehensive answer. So yeah, it seems that King Abdullah the First was quite prescient since he got assassinated in 1951. So yeah, so perhaps there was a method to his madness. But let's rewind a little bit to 1927, Zach. And again, this is for the people who believe that there is no such thing as Palestine or a Palestinian people. You mentioned the minting of coins. There was a compromise made by the Brits to not upset either the Arabs or the Jews. Would you mind telling us that particular story about how they minted the coin and what exactly were the words that were put on that particular coin? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so the British introduce a new currency,
Hmm.
um, the Palestine Pound, which
Hmm.
includes, they're issuing coins and bills, and and so there's this question of like what to print on the coins,
Hmm.
and the British mandate for Palestine is called like the government of Palestine. That is the name of this quasi independent government that is really ultimately part of the British Empire.
Hmm.
Um, but basically they decide to print the word, Palestina in
Hmm.
Hebrew on the coin, and Philistine in Arabic on the coin, and Palestine on the coin. And there's this uproar among the Zionists because I think they must have realized at that point that if they're gonna, you recall that in the Hebrew language, the land was not really known as
As,
Palestina.
yeah.
If you comb through Hebrew texts, go to the 18th, 19th century, and
Hmm.
look for the word Palestina in Hebrew,
Hmm.
you will find it here and there, but that is not the primary word being used in the Hebrew language. The
Right.
word being used in the Hebrew language is Eretz Israel.
That's
And,
right.
and I think the basic reason for that is like Hebrew was a dead language for
Hmm.
2,000 years.
Right.
And so it just didn't absorb new words, especially new geographical terms that
Hmm.
came into use after Hebrew died as a language, 2,000 years ago. So when it was revived, the name Eretz Israel continued to be used as basically the name of the country. And I think by the early 1920s, they had already kind of realized that basically the name Palestina was the name that the Palestinians were using to describe their homeland. And so, as a kind of a politicization,
Hmm.
of the geographical lexicon itself, at some point, some Zionist leaders must have realized, wow, we shouldn't call this place Palestine in Hebrew; we should call it Eretz Israel.
Hmm.
And so they lobby the British to change the name on the coin from Palestina in Hebrew to Eretz Israel.
Hmm.
And the British, being the British, always trying to make everybody happy and at the same time making nobody happy. What they do instead was they put the word they put the word Palestina in Hebrew on the coin, but then
Hmm.
in parentheses put Aleph
Aleph
Yud.
Yod. Yeah.
Exactly, which is sort of the short form for
Mhm.
Eretz Israel. They don't actually write
That's
out Eretz Israel.
right.
They just put the Aleph Yud.
Hmm.
So I don't think they really made anybody happy, but it's this sort of classic British compromise approach, which is,
Mm,
partition, right? It's the same concept of we'll make everybody happy, and at the same time, obviously, making nobody
make nobody
happy.
happy. Wow, amazing, amazing. So yeah, so in my location, obviously, I'm based in Dhaka, Bangladesh, and we went through our own partition while we were still a part of Pakistan, and India back in 1947. But yeah, yeah, partition seemed like the answer to everything back in those days. But I do sympathize with the UN being such a young body in 1947, 48, and inheriting this British problem on what to do with the historical land of Palestine. But let me just come to another question, Zach, and this was also from your dissertation. As we all know that in 1979, Egypt signed a peace treaty with Israel, but the Israeli delegation that went to Alexandria refused to stay at a particular hotel, even though it was the best hotel in Egypt, and they opted to stay somewhere else. Please tell us why that was.
Yes, it's a funny episode. The best hotel was called the Palestine Hotel, right? And there must have been some smarty pants on the Israeli delegation
Mhm.
who decided for whatever reason that we're not going to patron this Palestine Hotel because, right, there's no such thing as Palestine. It's called Israel. Because the word Palestine is bothers Israelis, right? Even to this day, right? It
Right.
bothers Jews more generally around the world as well. And anyone who's Zionist is bothered by this word Palestine, right? Because it's this constant reminder that actually there's this other
Mhm.
people.
Mhm.
Those other people were here first, and they called something else, and they still call it something else. So it's a constant reminder. So they don't like the word Palestine. They don't want to hear the word. They don't even want to stay at hotels named Palestine Hotel. So instead, they decide, if I recall, they decide to stay at the Saint Stefan Hotel, if I'm not
Right.
wrong.
You're right.
And
Yes. Yes.
and of course the irony, which was that I pointed out, this irony was pointed out by, I believe, by was an Israeli columnist at the time
Hmm.
who said, "Look, you guys aren't staying at the Palestine Hotel because you don't like the word Palestine. Instead, you're staying at the Saint Stefan Hotel, who
Hmm.
was a saint, who was a saint in what, the third or fourth century."
Hmm.
And the Jews at the time rejected this saint,
Hmm.
because the Jews rejected Christianity, and many Jews over the millennia, died being persecuted because they refused to accept Saint Stefan.
Hmm.
So it is kind of an irony of the whole situation, which is that this saint was kind of an excuse to kill many Jews over the years. So I'm not really sure why you would choose that over Palestine, but sort of that's how things turned out. But
Hmm.
yeah, I mean, the basic issue here is that there is this long-standing attempt among Zionists, among Israelis, to erase the name Palestine, to basically pretend that there never was a Palestine, that no one ever called
Hmm.
the place Palestine.
Right.
And that history was not just one episode in the early 1980s. You see
Hmm.
that over, I mean, even to this day, you have Israeli Knesset members
Hmm.
basically saying, look, there's no such thing as Palestine. I mean, the famous Golda Meir quote, right? There's no such thing as a Palestinian people. You have, Knesset members saying, look, there's no P in the Arabic language, therefore there couldn't possibly be a Palestine, right? So just all of these crazy ideas, just that honestly make the only real result of this effort to delegitimize the word Palestine is ultimately the delegitimization of the person saying that.
Hmm. Right. Yeah, yeah, you're right about that. There being no P in the Arabic language. But given that you're quite the polyglot, Zach, I think that you'd be the right person to ask this particular question. Nothing to do with your dissertation, but it's just something that I wanted to ask out of curiosity. Given that you speak English, Hebrew, Arabic, and Armenian fluently, um,
No. I do not speak Armenian.
right. So it was a self-deprecating joke that you had in your dissertation, which I really enjoyed. So, okay. So how significant has the Arabic language been in reviving Hebrew, given that you mentioned that it was a dead language? If you could just share your thoughts on that. Yeah.
That is a very good question. So the guy who revived the Hebrew language, his name is Eliezer Ben Yehuda,
Hmm.
and he was born, is it Russia or Poland, in the Pale settlement, I believe.
Yeah.
He migrated to Palestine in the early 20th century, I believe, in the 1901 or two or something like that. Um, and his basic idea here was that he was basically a cultural Zionist, right? You had all these
Hmm.
Zionists led by Ahad Ha'am who believed that what the Jews needed was not so much a state, but they needed cultural rejuvenation. They needed to revive their language, Hebrew. And Ben Yehuda really, I mean, he creates this modern Hebrew dictionary and starts speaking to his kids in Hebrew and basically tries to revive the language and succeeds. I mean, it's truly a remarkable story. Leaving aside the politics of Zionism, I mean, this is there are very few languages that really, especially dead languages that have been dead for thousands of years, that ever get revived. This is one of the few, perhaps the most successful story of kind of a language revival in all of human history. But it's a tremendous success story. And exactly, I do know that he did so in his attempt to revive the language. What he's doing is he's going around and finding and figuring out what words are missing, right? Because it's a dead language, hasn't been used in 2,000 years. They obviously don't have words for all of these modern things. So he's going around, and I do know that he does take many words from Arabic. He does, try and, because he, based on this idea that Arabic is a Semitic language, and so hey, let's try and find similar equivalents, basically to let's try and find kind of like what the word maybe would have been, if only Hebrew had survived. And so you grab the closest cognate in a Semitic language, which is Arabic. And of course, the Arabs are the ones living in Palestine. So, that also means he has access to them. He can find out what the word in Arabic is. I don't know the details of that history, though. There are experts on this, and we can consult an expert, but I don't actually know which words he took or how many he took or what other languages he borrowed from. But definitely he did take Arabic words and kind of reintroduce them into Hebrew.
Okay. All right. So no problem, Zach. So we'll take your answer as it is. And I think that's a really interesting discussion, but we could definitely have a whole episode on that at some future date. Let me come to a book that I have right behind me, Zach. And Sapiens, you've name dropped it a couple of times in your dissertation. You've expressed your admiration for Yuval Noah Harari. You've even named his other books, Homo Deus. But having said that, if I could just ask a tough question. When I asked Ilan Pape and Frank Barat, the authors of the book on Palestine, how important the events of 1948 is in order to understand the current situation that we find ourselves in with Israel and Palestine, they all consistently said that it is very important to know the history of the region, what happened with the events of 1948 in order to create a better future. Whereas, as far as I remember or recall, Yuval Noah Harari actually said that you have to forget about the past and just move forward from this point in. And so given your admiration for Yuval as a intellectual, where do you stand on this debate? Would you agree with what he said, or would you agree with Frank Barat and Ilan Pape and the rest of them? Yeah.
Look, Yuval Harari is a specialist of medieval Europe, military history. That is where, if you look at his first book or two, he's talking about cavalry and medieval battlefields. Like, he's not a historian of Israel Palestine. And then I think his later specialization, if you want to say, would be really global history, the bird's eye view, zooming out to 10,000 foot view and trying to understand the big trends in human history.
Right.
That is what Yuval Harari is very good at. Is trying to say, how is it that Homo sapiens conquered the world? How did we go from being this small, irrelevant pack of sapiens in East Africa 150,000 years ago to taking over Europe and replacing the Neanderthals, and then taking over Asia and replacing Homo habilis, and then conquering Australia 40,000, 50,000 years ago, and then conquering the New World? How is it that Homo sapiens took over the world? That is his question, and he's very good at understanding that bird's eye view of history. Now, when it comes to 20th century Israel-Palestine history, I don't see why Yuval Harari has any more insight or expertise than any other historian. That he doesn't have. That's not a specialization. Right. If anything, you might say, be careful about what he says, because he's an Israeli, and like many other Israelis, he was raised with all these myths and all this propaganda, and obviously he successfully figured out ways of blocking out some of it. But don't be fooled for a minute. Yuval Harari is not some kind of pro-Palestine activist. He does not really, in his work, write at all about, Palestinian human rights. He is not really. Have you ever seen Yuval Harari comment on what is happening in Masaf al-Yatta or Sheikh Jarrah or Gaza? Has he published a single article in his entire career on Israeli occupation, on the the permit regime, or the closure regime, or the apartheid regime, or the siege regime, or the 5 wars that Israel has waged on Gaza over the past 16 years? Has he published a single article on any of that? As far as I know, the answer is no. He's been consulted now because he's so famous for his work on the history of Homo sapiens, and because he's Israeli. Somehow, people think he has insight into what is happening right now in Gaza or the West Bank. But don't be mistaken; that is incorrect. I would not. I don't listen to what Yuval Harari has to say on the genocide happening, the genocidal war being waged on the people of Gaza right now. I would not trust Yuval Harari. That is not his area of expertise. I do not think he has ever really shown much sympathy for the Palestinians. That doesn't take away from what he has written about human history writ large.
Great. For sure. Yeah. And I think that's really well said, Zach. So in other words, he doesn't have the credentials to be talking about Israel-Palestine. And he's talking more as a popular figure rather than as an expert. So I think that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so Zach, we're pretty much coming to the end of our show, but just before we let you go, we have a couple of staple questions that we love to ask all our guests, right? So we are a podcast about books. It's in the title. And so with your permission, I'll just ask you 2 of our staple questions. And the first staple question is an easier one, but the second one is a bit more harder. But let me start with the easy one. Are you more of a fiction person or a nonfiction person? What genre of books does Dr. Zach Foster like to read?
No, I'm a nonfiction person. I have to confess that I've never been able to. I've met a handful of. I mean, honestly, I'm really confessing this. I've read a few of Dan Brown's novels. But I'm not a big fiction person.
Okay, no worries. So, and so the second question, and I'm told by a lot of our guests that it's a really tough one, but I'm sure that you can give us a really good answer to this. And the question is, if you could select a book that you feel that every young person should read at least once in their lifetime, it may be a book related to history or to geopolitics or not, but if you could pick a book that is both edifying and useful, what would be your pick?
Well, now I'm going to feel bad if I mention one of Yuval Harari's books because...
No, but please go ahead if you need to. Yeah.
These books that talk about the big picture, and there are a lot of these books. You have Jared Diamond's books, Guns, Germs, and Steel. You have Yuval Harari's books, The Sapiens. There are other books like this, but I really think they help you zoom out and really, it really gives you perspective on life. When you realize that for the vast majority of our history as a species, we were hunter-gatherers. We didn't even till the soil. 90% of human history was us in small bands, in small tribes, hunting and gathering. And that is really the core of what we are as a species. I really think that changes your perspective on things a little bit. I like those books a lot. Obviously, if you want books on Israel Palestine, I mean, I would recommend. Honestly, I would recommend Benny Morris's books. I would recommend Avi Shleim has a very good book called The Iron Wall. Obviously, Ilan Pape's books are very good. Simcha Flappin has a number of very good books. There's Rashid Khaledi's books are great. There's many great books on Israel Palestine if you want kind of the bird's eye view. But I think for a general audience, I think I would just generally speaking recommend books that try and kind of zoom out and get out of the weeds and try and understand the big picture.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned Professor Dr. Benny Morris, Zach. So let me just take that opportunity to ask you just one final question with regards to Dr. Benny Morris. His book is obviously called The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem, 1947 to 49. And Professor Dr. Ilan Pape's book is called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. And given that they're both considered new historians, they're looking at the same set of data, but they've come to vastly different conclusions. One believes that there was no conscious ethnic cleansing, whereas Professor Pape says that there was a conscious ethnic cleansing. How do you explain that, Zach? I mean, where do you sit firstly on this debate? And why do you believe that they came to such vastly different conclusions, given that they're all looking at the same set of data? So help us understand that.
Criminals very rarely, let me start over. For the most part, criminals do not want to leave behind records of criminality. Okay. Now, the Zionists were well aware of this from the 1920s. There was a Zionist leader in the 1920s who was speaking openly of the transfer idea. Okay. And there was all this press coverage in the Western media, basically critiquing this guy, basically calling for what we would today describe as ethnic cleansing.
Hmm.
At the time, it was known as transfer. Um, and Zionists realized very, very early on that they cannot talk about this in public. Okay.
Hmm.
Um, and so throughout the 1920s and 30s and 40s, the Zionists continued to talk about transfer, but primarily in private. It's in the diary entries, and the private committees that were formulated within the Zionist community behind closed doors, where they're talking about transfer. They literally have transfer committees in the 1940s. And then if you look at Ben Gurion's diary entries, if you look at even going back even further, Theodore Herzl writes in his diary in 1891, he says we need to spirit the population across the border.
Hmm.
So the Zionists were very conscious of that there was basically consensus that in order to establish a Jewish state in a majority non-Jewish country, there would probably there would need to be some kind of transfer. And there was also awareness that the Palestinians were not going to leave on their own. So
Hmm.
both of those two things, I think, were realized by a majority of Zionists. And then if you sort of add two and two together, you get four, which is ethnic cleansing. But they knew they couldn't talk about that openly. And so I think the real difference here is like, um, Ilan Pape, he adds two and two and arrives at four,
Hmm.
whereas Benny Morris adds two and two and is like, listen, I don't know what 2 + 2 equals. I
Hmm.
mean, that's really what we're talking about here, because you have all these transfer
Hmm.
discussions for decades.
Right.
And then once you have the 1948 war, you even in the early months of the war, the Zionists were losing.
Hmm.
You know,
Right.
you have the partition plan in November 1947, and then in December and January 1948, and maybe even into February, basically the Arab militias, the Palestinian Arab fighters, they're able to kind of cut off supply lines, and Jerusalem is
Hmm.
under threat. The Zionists are kind of fear that they're going to lose control of Jerusalem.
Hmm.
And so they basically go on this offensive that becomes known that at the time is known as Plan Dalet. It wasn't
Hmm.
revealed until after the war, but
Right.
it's a blueprint for ethnic cleansing. It basically says, it's a blueprint for establishing a Jewish state. The way you establish a Jewish state is you remove hostile Arabs. And
Hmm.
everyone knew what this plan involved. All the generals knew. And so,
Hmm.
and they knew, they fundamentally understood what the goal was. The goal was to
Hmm.
establish a Jewish state. And in order to establish a Jewish state, you needed a Jewish majority. And in order to establish a Jewish majority, you cannot have this large number of Palestinians inside the state.
Hmm.
And so they went village to village in April and May and June and July and expelled Palestinians. First, they did this from the coast. They scared Palestinians into leaving. Then they did it in the interior. In June and July, they go to Ramle and Lid, and Tantura, and commit massacres. The rumors of the massacres spread, and Palestinians leave.
Hmm.
But in many cases, in Ramle and Lid in July 1948, they show up to the village. They massacre 100, 200 Palestinians, and they basically push everyone else out, and they flee to the West Bank.
Hmm.
But and then they do the same in the Galilee later in the year, in July, in the fall of 1948. In October and November, they go to the Galilee. It's basically the same thing. They expel many Palestinians from those villages, and to pretend like this was all a coincidence, this was all an accident. Oh, we really wish they were good. We had hoped they would stay. I mean, really, you actually believe that?
Hmm.
So no, it was very methodical. It was planned. They did their best to hide the evidence. They continue to hide the evidence to this day. They reclassify documents that have already been opened.
Wow.
They're going back and purging the archives of any
Hmm.
evidence that this ever happened. It was very clearly a plan.
Hmm.
Based on decades of discussions from the most senior level of the Zionist community, from basically the executive branch of the Zionist community. These discussions were taking place. So Benny Morris, I mean, he may not want to accept the fact that this was very much a plan and a strategy, and it was implemented, and there were orders given. And because he can't find a smoking gun document, maybe he says,
Hmm.
"Oh, it was,
Right.
in the fog of war, and we can't prove it was ethnic cleansing because we don't have a direct order." But I think I would describe that as an inability to be able to add 2 + 2.
Hmm.
He says, "Look, we don't know what 2 + 2 equals. Elon says we do."
Right. Yeah. And then I think it was Professor Pape who said that, look, when Hitler committed the Holocaust, he didn't have a direct order given to his underlings, right? So it was just implied, and that's what happened. And so as historians, we not only have to look at the data, but be able to interpret it in an intelligent fashion. So yes, thank you so much for those thoughts. So Zach, we've gone way over time. We've gone way over time, but I really want to thank you for coming on the show and for discussing this entire topic with us. I think it's been really edifying and useful for our audience in Bangladesh and in the Bengali diaspora. Just one final question. Given that you've written such an amazing dissertation, when can your fans and readers expect a book to come out? Will it come out anytime soon? A book at all? So if you could help us understand that.
Thank you for that question. Look, I will confess that I don't have any immediate plans to publish the dissertation as a book. I hope to one day. Look, I would say that, once it's in book format, the publisher will
slice and
probably
dice it, or
well, look, it's behind a paywall at that point, right? You have to buy it.
Right.
Right now it's free. So I want my work to be accessible to everyone.
Okay.
So look, it may at some point become a book, but then it would be behind a paywall and harder to access. So maybe enjoy the free version of it while it still exists. And look, if I were to publish it as a book, I would probably revise it. There are certain things, it would be an updated version. There would be meaningful changes to it. So hopefully, I do hope to be able to one day do that, but it's not really on the roadmap as of right now.
Okay. All right. So I have to say that I've really enjoyed reading the free version of it. It is only available on academia.edu. Is that correct?
It may be available in I think ProQuest may have a version of it, but yeah, you can find it on academia.edu for free.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so on that note, for our viewers and listeners who have been with us all this time, thank you very much for staying till the end. If you are watching this episode on YouTube, do please be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that bell icon. The episode will also be available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. Dr. Zach Foster, my thanks to you as well, my friend. Thank you so much for coming on the show and for enlightening us about your dissertation and about Israel and Palestine in general. You've been a wonderful guest. I've really enjoyed talking to you. I've really learned a lot from this particular episode. And I really hope to have you back at some point for a future episode. So thank you very much. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely. It would be my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.